Welcome to the Institute for Research on Poverty's webinar series. I'm your host, Steve Cook. Our presentation today is on the decentralization of the U.S. safety net. Joining us are Sarah Bruch, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Iowa, Marcia Meyers, Professor of Social Work and Public Affairs at the University of Washington, and Janet Gornick, Professor of Political Science and Sociology at the City University of New York. In addition to thanking our presenters for sharing their research with us today, IRP would also like to thank the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services for their support of this webinar series. We would like to encourage the audience to participate in today's presentation. You will notice the question and answer box at the bottom of your screens. You can submit questions anytime throughout the presentation. We've reserved time at the end of the webinar for our presenters to respond. Now Sarah is going to start us off. Sarah?
Thanks for giving us the opportunity to present our work on the implications of having a decentralized safety net in the U.S. Although there's going to be three of us on the call today, in the interest of simplifying the presentation, Marcia and I will be presenting the main findings of the paper, and Janet will join us for your questions at the end during the Q&A. In today's presentation, we'll start by discussing the motivation for why we focus on the decentralized safety net and describe some of the key features of the current structure of the safety net. Then we're going to describe the data and measures that we use in our work, detail a number of the research questions we explore using this data, and discuss some of the main findings. We'll end by talking about some of the implications of our work. One of the most underappreciated features of the U.S. welfare state is the extent, impact, and implications of having a largely decentralized safety net. For working-age adults and children, there are few truly national or universal benefits. Instead, these families rely primarily on limited and localized safety net programs that are administered and financed, at least in part, by state governments. One of the primary motivations for us engaging in research on the decentralized safety net is a concern that having social provisions structured in this way creates fertile ground for unequal responses to citizen needs. Among academics and policy researchers, this concern is expressed as equity-related arguments, which suggest that all citizens should have access to equal or equivalent public assistance when in need, or economic rights-based arguments, which claim that access to basic economic resources should have the same standing as citizenship rights. The concern about unequal responses to citizen needs was heightened by the significant changes made to safety net policies in the welfare reform era of the 1990s. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act reworked the safety net for economically vulnerable families with children, most notably by replacing a federally mandated entitlement with a discretionary conditional right to cash assistance managed by state authorities. During the same period, federal lawmakers made other changes in the balance of federal and local control over assistance for low-income households, including imposing stricter requirements on states to collect child support obligations and creating incentives for states to expand child care and health insurance programs. In the late 2000s, the concern about unequal responses to citizen needs was further magnified by the Great Recession. James DeParle, writing in the New York Times, captured this sentiment well in a piece during the height of the economic downturn in 2009, noting that the most vulnerable victims of the recession confronted a jumble of disconnected programs that reach some and reject others, often for reasons of geography or chance rather than differences in need. This quote captures the fundamental weakness of having a decentralized safety net, that the safety net programs available to economically vulnerable families are determined in large part by the state they happen to reside in, so much so that the saying, "pick your parents well," can now be expanded to say, "and hope they live in a state with a robust safety net." In our view, this is a form of inequality that deserves our attention. In recent years, especially since 2008, inequality has received an extraordinary amount of attention in political and policy circles. During the 2012 and 2016 election cycles, candidates from both political parties raised inequality as a condition worthy of concern. Several candidates organized their campaigns around crafting effective institutional and policy responses to high or rising inequality. This contemporary national conversation about inequality has focused almost exclusively on disparities in outcomes. Attention has focused on inequalities of income and wealth, as well as differentials in access to employment, to quality schooling, to safe neighborhoods, and to affordable health care. It's also common to equate inequality with intergroup disparities. That is, the difference in outcomes between African Americans and whites, between men and women, between young and old, between the more or less educated, between immigrants and the native born, and so on. In our view, in the United States, there is another enormously consequential axis of inequality, one that has received inadequate attention in contemporary academic and policy circles. That is, inequality by geography, specifically inequality across the 50 U.S. states. Policy scholars have long studied cross-state policy variation, including both levels and trends. Often they utilize this variation as a methodological tool for policy evaluation. However, state-to-state policy variation is rarely conceptualized as a form of inequality per se. Yet, in our view, that's precisely how it should be viewed. And our empirical work demonstrates the decentralized policy structure in place in the U.S. leads to a condition that can be characterized as unequal public responses to common citizen needs. In practice, this means, as I mentioned earlier, that where a child is born or where an economically vulnerable family lands, for whatever reason, potentially shapes their resources, their well-being, and ultimately their life chances. In other words, one's state of residence matters, and it matters a lot. Safety net provision for economically needy, non-disabled, working-age adults and their dependents is a patchwork of income transfers, in-kind assistance, and services, all of which are funded with a combination of federal, state, and local tax revenues, and managed either jointly by federal and state governments or wholly at the state and local levels. To examine the consequences of having a decentralized safety net, we created a unique data set that has been assembled from publicly accessible state and federal administrative records and original population estimates calculated using the annual social and economic supplement of the current population survey. The data includes 11 federal state programs. The programs are cash assistance, AFDC and TANF, food assistance, food stamps or SNAP, child health insurance, which includes both Medicaid and CHIP, child support enforcement, child care subsidies from the Child Care and Development Fund and TANF, early childhood education, which includes Head Start and state pre-K programs, unemployment insurance, targeted work assistance through the AFDC and TANF programs, child disability assistance in the Supplemental Security Income Program, housing assistance, which is Section 8 vouchers, and state income taxes, which captures the tax liability threshold and credits for low-income families. You'll notice that programs such as the federal EITC and child tax credit are not included. The programs that we include are those in which states have some form of discretion in financing, administration, or policymaking. To compare aspects of safety net provision across states, we constructed measures of two dimensions of social provision, the adequacy of benefits and inclusiveness of receipt. For each type of assistance, adequacy is calculated by dividing total benefit spending, federal or state, by a state's average or total caseload. Inclusion is calculated by dividing the number of actual program recipients in a state by the number of potentially needy individuals or families in the state. For means-tested programs, the estimates of the potentially needy is the number of individuals or families who first fall into categorically eligible groups and second, have market or pre-tax and transfer incomes below the federal poverty threshold. These are estimated using 3-year moving averages from the annual social and economic supplement of the current population survey. These measures of adequacy and inclusion are calculated yearly starting in 1994 and going through to 2014 for each of the 11 types of assistance for all 50 states. These data are unique in providing comparable measures across programs over an extended period of time. However, it is important to note that these measures are not measures of the actual benefits received by recipients or the share of eligible individuals or households who are served. They are estimates from our aggregate state-level reports on spending for benefits and caseloads, and of categorically matched, potentially eligible low-income families. What our measures do provide are reasonably comparable estimates of the outputs of different programs across different states over time. Another way to think about them is as estimates of the average likelihood that someone in need will receive assistance from a particular program in a particular state and the average benefit or cost for the service they receive. These data allow us to conduct one of the only longitudinal studies of multiple programs that make up the safety net in different states.
That was the handoff. So in the working paper and in our talk today, we begin by asking two basic questions that actually have been surprisingly hard to answer in the past due to the lack of this kind of data that allows us to compare state-level provisions across multiple programs. The first question is, what is the magnitude across state variation in these two dimensions, the adequacy and inclusiveness of safety net provisions? And second, does the magnitude of variation within each program correspond to the extent or type of state discretion in that program?
So to look at our first question, to assess the magnitude of the variation in safety net provision, we first look at levels, variation in the levels of adequacy and inclusiveness using the absolute values that are observed at different points in the distribution of the 50 states. For each program, we compare levels in the middle, or the hypothetical average state, and the levels near the top at the 90th percentile and those near the bottom at the 10th percentile. This tells us something about the range of variation in the levels of adequacy and inclusion between states near the top, bottom, and middle of the distribution. We can't actually compare these ranges directly across different programs when we look at the amount of variation, because the ranges reflect absolute values. So higher absolute values tend to have bigger ranges and smaller values, smaller ranges. So instead we calculate a standardized value, which is the coefficient of variation, or COV, which is calculated as the standard deviation divided by the mean. To answer the second question about whether these standardized measures of state variation correspond to the extent and type of discretion that states exercise, we needed to come up with a way to sort or rank the programs by the extent of devolved authority. To do this, we turned to the substantial literatures on federalism, intergovernmental policymaking, and program implementation to consider the various ways in which policy design influences the level and type of discretion for subnational government actors, including legislators, elected officials, administrators, managers, and even frontline workers. We developed a typology of the 11 programs that considered three dimensions of policy design that shape the extent and type of discretion exercised at the state level. The first dimension is the structure of authority and responsibility for financing programs. All of the programs in the safety net for working age families have some degree of shared responsibility for financing, with the exceptions of SNAP, food assistance, for which the federal government pays for benefits, and state tax policy benefiting the poor, for which states have discretion. But in between these extremes, we find a complex mix of funding arrangements that differ across and even within areas of assistance. From individual entitlements for child SSI, which provides relatively little discretion for subnational actors, to block grants for TANF cash assistance and child care subsidies that give state policymakers much broader authority about the use of funds. A second area of policy design that influences state discretion and state-to-state variation is the extent and type of authority that states have to set policy for program eligibility, conditions of receipt, benefit levels, and so on. This varies from programs operating with federally established rules for eligibility and benefit determination, such as SSI and SNAP, to those that leave these and other decisions to states within broad program guidelines or performance standards. Finally, the most difficult to observe levels of state discretionary action and state variation are those in program administration. Once again, policy design in each program shapes the types of decisions and actions that are left to state and local actors. Do they do outreach? How hard is it to apply? How much paperwork do you need to turn in and how often? How hard is it for providers to get reimbursed, etc.? Marcia, are you with us?
I am. Is this working?
All right. Yeah, take it away.
So what we're arguing here is that while all of the programs in the safety net for this population are decentralized, the authority is not devolved to the same extent or in the same way in each of the programs. And those differences in the devolution of authority are going to matter for the amount of discretion exercised at the subnational level and for the corresponding amount of variation across states in the adequacy of benefits and the inclusiveness of the program. So using these three dimensions, we construct a typology, which we have here, that arrays our 11 programs in roughly 3 tiers of the extent of devolved authority and opportunities for state-level actors to exercise discretion. The programs with the least amount of state discretion, or the most centralized funding and policy authority, are the Child SSI and the Food Assistance Program through SNAP. A middle tier has a mix of programs that are state-administered but have been under fairly specific federal rules either since inception or since the 1990s, including child support collections, unemployment insurance, Section 8 housing assistance, and child health insurance through the Medicaid and CHIP programs. And the final tier is the most devolved set of programs in which states are able to exercise the greatest discretion. From state tax policies, which are entirely state-controlled, to the TANF cash assistance and child care block grants, which include the targeted employment services for the TANF recipients, and the early education programs. Each of these have a mix of federal and state authority, granting states a great deal of discretion to provide services, set policy, and design their own administrative and management structures largely within relatively broad performance standards. So given this categorization, we formulate 4 general expectations about what we're going to observe in terms of cross-state policy variation in our data. First, thinking about the adequacy of benefits, we expect to see less cross-state variation in the adequacy of benefits when states have relatively less responsibility for financing and less discretion and authority over setting policy. And correspondingly, we would expect to see more variation in programs for which states have greater levels of authority to set benefit levels, set the amount and type of services provided, time limits, and so on through their authority to set policy. And our second set of expectations have to do with inclusion, the inclusiveness of programs. And here we expect to observe more variation overall in the inclusiveness of receipt than in the adequacy of the benefits in most of the programs, regardless of the overall levels of discretion. So why would that be? Well, when we think about adequacy, state policy officials have only partial control over benefit levels in a lot of programs, not only because of federal rules, but also because if it's a service provision program, such as health care, it's also going to be a function. The ultimate spending per recipient is going to be a function both of government actions and their interactions with market processes. It's really in the inclusion of individuals into the program that subnational actors have the most control and the most ability to use some of these less visible processes to influence the number of applicants and the success of applicants in obtaining assistance. And so finally, our fourth expectation related to this is that we expect inequality or variation across states to be in inclusiveness to be highest in programs for which states have the highest levels of authority, particularly in the second 2 areas of setting policy and the administration or management of programs, which provide key tools for controlling access to assistance. And back to Sarah.
Thanks, Marcia. So in terms of our results, we find that there is substantial cross-state variation in safety net provision across all 11 of the programs. Looking first at the magnitude of cross-state variation in the adequacy of benefits, you can see in Table 2 on the screen, we have here the 50-state mean, the standard deviation, the coefficient of variation, the 10th and the 90th percentiles, and the absolute difference between the 10th and 90th percentiles. So I'll walk through a couple of examples. First, looking at cash assistance, we can see that a family receiving cash assistance in a state at the 50-state average received almost $4,000 in assistance, while a family in a state at the 10th percentile received less than $2,000, and a family in a state at the 90th percentile received almost $6,000. Clearly, these are substantially large differences. The difference here between the 10th and the 90th percentiles is almost $4,000. In unemployment insurance, an unemployed worker received an average of $4,800 in a state at the 50-state average, but only about $3,200 in a state at the 10th percentile and about $6,200 in a state at the 90th percentile. The difference here between the 10th and the 90th percentile is almost $3,000. In terms of what a 3-person family with 2 children can expect to receive or pay in state income taxes, this family in the average state would receive about $250. But in the 10th percentile state, this same family would have a tax liability of almost $150, which is much different than at the 90th percentile state, where this family would receive a tax return of over $1,000. As we expected, we observed greater variation in the adequacy of benefits in those programs for which states have greater financing responsibility and control. So to compare the cross-state variation across programs, we're using the coefficient of variation because, as we mentioned earlier, it's scale invariant, and so it isn't affected by the differences in the absolute values in the benefits across the programs. The COV measures are largest, ranging from 0.18 to 0.87 in 6 programs that have medium or high levels of state discretion and funding. For example, state income taxes, which are financed entirely at the state level and reflect state policy choices, are one of the highest. 3 of the other programs with substantial cross-state variation, targeted work assistance, cash assistance, and child care, are funded with federal TANF block grant and state matching funds, which gives states substantial discretion over the level and allocation of funds for various activities. In contrast, 2 programs with the least cross-state variation, food assistance and SSI, are largely or entirely federally funded, leaving states with limited discretion for determining total spending or individual benefit levels. Turning to look at the inclusiveness of receipt, we also find substantial cross-state variation. For example, in cash assistance, in the average state, 19 out of 100 poor families receive cash assistance. But at the 10th percentile, that's only 6 out of 100, and at the 90th percentile, it's 37 out of 100 poor families receiving cash assistance. Similarly, in the early childhood education program, this is experienced by 23 out of 100 3- and 4-year-olds in the average state, but only 7 in the state at the 10th percentile and 59 out of 100 in the 90th percentile state. Our second expectation about the relationship between the levels of state discretion in financing, administration, and policymaking was that in most programs, we expected cross-state variation would be greater in the inclusiveness of receipt than for the adequacy of benefits. Figure 1 on the screen shows this to be the case in 8 out of the 11 programs. Here, the COV is being graphed with the gray bars representing inclusion and the black bars representing adequacy. For example, the COV in cash assistance adequacy is 0.40, whereas for inclusion, it's much larger at 0.63. This is also true for child support, food assistance, unemployment insurance, supplemental security income, early childhood education, child care, and housing assistance. The extent of cross-state variation by program also conforms to our third expectation, that variation would be greatest in programs over which states exercise discretion in policymaking and administration. 4 of the 11 programs that we look at are characterized as having high levels of both policy authority and administrative flexibility: cash assistance, early childhood education, child care, and targeted work assistance. And these programs are among the most variable across states. High levels of state variation in the TANF-related programs is not surprising, given the explicit devolution of authority to set eligibility criteria and rules in the TANF block grant. The variation in inclusiveness of early childhood education programs reflects the combination of Head Start, a federally administered program, and state-initiated and managed pre-K programs, which vary dramatically across states. In contrast, the programs with the least variation in the inclusiveness of receipt, food assistance, and child health insurance, are both subject to federal eligibility criteria and require states to seek waivers for significant deviations from these criteria. Variation in the children's SSI program is also substantial, suggesting that factors such as outreach and local administration of intake and eligibility determination may be highly influential. So, as expected, we find that the magnitude of cross-state inequality corresponds closely to the level of state and local authority for financing, policy, and administration. The highest levels of cross-state inequality are observed in those programs for which states have the highest level of financial responsibility and greater policy and administrative discretion, especially in regard to the inclusiveness of program receipts. Marcia?
So our next set of questions have to do with change over time. Given substantial subnational discretion on program financing, policy, and administration, one of the concerns that we might have has been that states will compete against each other to have the lowest benefits and the least inclusive safety net programs, creating what we call the race to the bottom for social provisions, and perhaps an overall retrenchment in essential safety net programs. On the other hand, the main argument for decentralization and the devolution of authority is that it will free states to be more innovative and responsive to local needs. The safety net has always been decentralized in the United States, but there's good evidence and reason to think that it was even further devolved in some areas through the welfare reforms of the 1990s. So we're able to use the longitudinal structure of our data to consider both of these possibilities. First, do we see evidence that there has been a race to the bottom or retrenchment in safety net provision overall or in some programs in the post-welfare reform era? And perhaps a related question is whether there's been some expansion in response to the economic downturns of the 21st century. And second, did states pull closer together or further apart in their provisions during this era? I.e., has there been convergence or divergence in safety net provisions? Although we know that there's substantial cross-level variation, it's really an outstanding empirical question as to whether and how that variation changed following the devolution of greater authority in the TANF-related programs and in the creation of new federal benefit extensions and incentives in response to the Great Recession of the 2000s. So the outstanding question is whether states pulled further apart as they tried new approaches with their new flexibility, or perhaps converged as they responded to similar economic conditions and or federal incentives. So to answer the first question of the two, we're going to look at trends in the average levels of adequacy and inclusion in this period from 1994 to 2014. The first figure shows the average of the 50 state averages for annual spending per recipient, our measure of adequacy, i.e. the benefits or costs of service per recipients. And these are in constant dollars adjusted for inflation. So starting with 6 of the programs that provide either cash or near cash benefits, we see that in most programs, the adequacy of assistance was actually fairly constant during this period. We're, most of us, probably familiar with graphs that show the declines in total spending following the welfare reforms of the 1990s, particularly in the TANF program. And we do see that here, the blue line, which is TANF, with the adjusted spending per recipient for TANF, spending declines about 33% from $6,000 to an average of $4,000 annually per recipient family. But the only other cash or near cash program that declined substantially in constant dollars during this period is the dollar value of child support collections, which is the brown line. This is often explained as a byproduct of increased collections during this period, which extended child support collections into populations of absent parents, usually fathers, who had lower incomes. It's also worth noting 2 other changes. One is the assistance provided to poor families through state taxes the line at the bottom, the red line at the bottom, although small in magnitude, it is a positive change, actually increasing slightly from a tax liability of about $80 on average in 1994 to a benefit of about $250 by 2014. And one other notable trend is that of the unemployment insurance program, which is the only one that shows a distinct pattern of response to economic change, to the recession of 2001 and then the Great Recession beginning in 2007, rising in the early 2000s and then declining and then rising again after 2007. The rise in benefits, the rise in adequacy having to do primarily with longer periods of UI collection and by collection of UI by higher waged workers who are unemployed. So that's the cash and near cash programs. The next slide shows quite a different story about adequacy over time, changes in adequacy trends over time. When we look at programs that provide in-kind goods or services.
Janet. So just to pick up where Marcia picked off, the story about adequacy, we've learned looks quite different when we're looking at programs that provide services and goods that are more in-kind. Nearly all of these had some modest to steep increase in spending per recipient. So spending per recipient for child health insurance through Medicaid and through the CHIP program, that's the brown line, as you can see, rose slowly throughout the period. There were more substantial increases in spending per child when we look at child care and early education, meaning Head Start, public pre-K, although quite a drop-off in the preschool spending per child, as you can see, that kicked in around 2010.
Okay, and this is Marcia. So we can go on to the next slide. That was adequacy. Trends in inclusiveness of receipt, or the number of recipients in each state relative to need, which has really been the hardest dimension of the safety net to observe over time. We really see more dramatic changes and more dramatic differences across programs. Starting again with the 6 cash or near cash programs, we're looking at the average of the 50 state averages of the number of recipients in each state relative to the population in need. And we see both increasing and declining inclusion of those in need. The most dramatic decline is the most familiar, the story of the precipitous drop in TANF recipiency, which is the blue line here. That is the decline in the average number of TANF recipients relative to the number of poor families with children, from an average of about 60% to less than 20%. Meanwhile, however, the inclusiveness of other cash and near cash programs was rising during most of the period. The number of families receiving SNAP food assistance, that's the green line, relative to the number in poverty or near poverty, declined through the end of the 1990s as restrictions adopted as a part of welfare reform were implemented. But then it headed up again as federal lawmakers first reversed some of these restrictions in the mid-2000s and then created new incentives and funding through the Recovery Act following the Great Recession. The number of child support collections relative to the number of single-parent families, that's the brown line, also is quite dramatic. It went up very steeply in the late 1990s, again following changes in federal policy and incentives included in the Personal Responsibility Act, but then leveled off and remained relatively constant for the rest of the period. And once again, the number of individuals receiving UI, and this is relative to the number unemployed, the orange line, shows the pattern of responsiveness to economic downturns, rising after the 2001 recession, declining again, and then rising very steeply following 2007, and then beginning to decline again during the latter part of that recessionary period, when either more of the eligible workforce found work or ran out of benefits and became part of the discouraged and non-working workforce. So finally, we're going to look at change over time in the average inclusiveness of the 5 in-kind benefit or service programs. And here again, it's kind of a remarkable story about the increase, particularly in health insurance receipts for poor children, which is the green line, which is measured here as the number of children receiving subsidized health insurance relative to the number of families under 300% of the poverty line. And with the expansions of the Medicaid and state CHIP programs, inclusion goes up quite remarkably 46%, from 46% in 1994 to 85% by 2012. We also see that both early education, the blue line, and subsidized child care in orange began to rise early in the period in the late 1990s. But following the 2001 recession, the first recession in this time period, inclusion in both stalled and declined. By the end of the period, the number of children in some type of public preschool programs was still up, but the number of children served with child care subsidies relative to the number of poor children had actually declined by the end of the period. So in sum, the answer to our first question about change over time, despite some predictions about a wholesale retrenchment and race to the bottom following welfare reforms of the 1990s, or of a substantial collapse of the safety net during the Great Recession, the story is actually more complex, and it's not one of overall retrenchment. Spending per recipient does not show dramatic declines in cash or near cash programs other than TANF, and spending per recipient for many kinds of services, including preschool, child care, and health care, actually increased. But the real action, the real change in the safety net during this 20-year period were changes in inclusion, this dimension that's not systematically tracked or measured for any of these programs. Here we see quite dramatic contraction in TANF cash assistance alongside pretty much equally dramatic increases in other forms of support, child support collections, SNAP food assistance, and child health insurance recipiency. A little bit less encouraging story of initial increases in child care and subsidized housing and preschool that either flattened out or actually declined by the end of the period. And as others have reported, of all the 11 programs, only the unemployment insurance program shows any clear responsiveness to economic downturns during the period. And over to Sarah.
Thanks, Marcia. Now that Marcia's gone through the changes in levels, our second question was about changes over time in the extent of cross-state variation. So we're asking, has there been increased divergence or convergence in provision across the states? To do this, we look at the COVs and the changes in the COV over time. Overall, what we find is limited evidence of convergence and several examples of states pulling further apart. So at the beginning of and end of the period, states were relatively tightly clustered in measures of adequacy. The COV changed significantly in only 2 programs, spending per participant in targeted work assistance for TANF recipients, and states pulled somewhat closer together in the value of SSI benefits. Looking at inclusion instead of adequacy, we find that state provisions were more diverse, more variation, and that there was more changes in the variation over time. During this period, states diverged to a significant degree in the inclusiveness of 3 programs: cash assistance, early childhood education, and child care. They pulled closer together in only 1, child support collections. It's notable that the 3 programs in which we observed substantial divergence in the magnitude of cross-state variation, cash assistance, targeted work assistance, and child care, were all directly affected by the welfare reforms in the 1990s, which granted states greater flexibility. However, the location of the changes within the total distribution of state efforts varied. States pulled further apart on the adequacy of targeted employment assistance due to very large increases in spending by the states at the top of the distribution. The divergence in the inclusiveness of cash assistance and child care, in contrast, was driven largely by especially steep reductions in states that began the period with low levels of provision. Divergence in the early childhood education program resulted from nearly the opposite change, with low provision states contracting slightly, while those near the 90th percentile nearly doubled the share of children served. It's equally notable that the single program for which we observed significant convergence across the states, Child Support Inclusion, was also addressed in the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. In this case, rather than increasing state flexibility, federal lawmakers increased expectations for state performance along with administrative funds for meeting new standards. So in this case, we see evidence of some catching up through increased efforts by states around the 10th percentile of the distribution, but an even greater increase for efforts by states near the top of the distribution. Our examination of the magnitude and location of state change in state variation suggests that rather than changing course to experiment with new approaches, states have continued in their original trajectories. High provision states expanded social benefits, and lower provision states contracted the adequacy or inclusiveness of assistance. Further confirmation of this analysis of the state distribution is provided by analyzing individual state changes. So examining the number of states that move in the same direction and examining the similarity in how states are ordered or ranked over time. The measure of how many states moved in the same direction over this time period is referred to as a measure of synchronicity. To measure rank concordance, we use the Kendall coefficient of rank concordance, which ranges from 0 to 1, which indicates no association between the ranks at 0, and 1, which indicates perfect concordance. Overall, both of these measures indicate that the vast majority of social safety net programs, states moved up or down together and maintained their relative rank to each other. The extent to which states move in the same direction is demonstrated even more clearly by using a specific example. In this figure, we're showing you the changes over time in the adequacy of food assistance benefits. States are ordered from top to bottom according to the average food assistance benefit received by a poor family in each state in 1994. Each panel of the figure displays the change in the benefit for a 5-year period. A blue bar represents an increase during the period, and the left edge of the bar is the starting value. A red bar indicates a decrease, and the right edge of the bar is the starting value. What this figure clearly shows is that in the early period of welfare reform in the mid-1990s, the average food assistance received by families declined in all but one state. This decline is in large part an indirect consequence of welfare reform, which led to a dramatic decrease in participation in cash assistance in the late 1990s, which also impacted participation in food stamps. From 1999 to 2009, the average food assistance received increased substantially in all states, reflecting the increased outreach and simplified application and recertification process, which increased the length of time households received assistance and also reflects the temporary increases in benefits from the ARRA. The last period shows a reversal of this increase in the benefit adequacy in all 50 states, showing a reduction in benefits. What this example makes clear is that the lack of change in cross-state variation is explained in part by states tending to change over time together, in this case in response to federal policy changes. In most cases, it is not true that state laggards further retrench their programs and state leaders expand their programs. Instead, it is more accurate to think of states as moving somewhat together in the same direction. Marcia?
The decentralized safety net in the U.S. is really the only source of assistance for most working-aged individuals and families in economic need in the U.S. And really the state-to-state variation in the provisions of the safety net is one of the most crucial yet least carefully studied structural design features of the U.S. welfare state. Arguably, we don't have a United States safety net for working-age families. We have 50 different safety nets. And we would argue that this level of variation is itself a form of inequality. Inequality in treatment of similar needs and claims made by people who happen to live in different states. And our second observation is that the extent of state-to-state variation is a function of policy design. All safety net programs are decentralized, but some are more decentralized than others, and some are decentralized in different aspects than others. And we find that the magnitude of cross-state variation or inequality corresponds closely to the level of state and local authority and discretion, particularly in policy and administration. We can also see the association between policy design and structure and state variation when we look at change over time. Not only are cross-state inequalities greatest in the most evolved programs at a point in time, but following the devolution of greater authority under Perora, states diverged and inequalities increased in the several TANF-related programs that were moved in the TANF case from an entitlement to a block grant. And finally, when we look a little more closely at change over time, looking at this question of how states use discretion we don't find much evidence to support the optimistic predictions that states use discretion to launch a variety of innovative approaches to improving the safety net program. But rather, states tend to change together in response to federal policy and other external shocks. And they tend to rate though with the high provision states expanding and the lower provision states contracting, maintaining their relative position in inclusiveness in the system. So I think that's our formal comments. We would like to thank our audience, acknowledge the support that we've gotten, and answer any questions that have come up.
Thank you, Marcia and Sarah and Janet. That was a very interesting and provocative discussion. So for those in the audience who have questions, reminder that you can type those into the Q&A box at the bottom of the presentation screen, and we'll have our panelists answer as many of those as we can get to. So first I'd like to start off with a question. So I know most of the analysis here was looking at kind of comparing individual programs, so comparing food assistance or comparing cash assistance. Have you done any work that looks at kind of a cumulative measure, maybe talks about the way the full package of the safety net is rising or declining across states over time?
Marcia, I'll
Sure.
jump in on that one.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a complicated one because, first of all, when you look at in response to the question about the overall increase or decrease, expansion or retrenchment, what looking at it program by program shows us is that it's really what we're calling a retooling. There isn't a single trend.
Right.
Cash assistance contracted, services expanded. So how do you characterize that overall? It is not actually additive because you can't actually pay your bills with an access to health insurance. However, that should reduce out-of-pocket expenses. So it's hard to say overall there's an expansion or retrenchment. I think we would say that there's a retooling, and it's kind of surprising, I think, given a lot of the rhetoric, that there were quite substantial expansions in some areas of the safety net overall on average. The second part of that, which you may be thinking about, is could we put it together as a package at the state level? And there, again, we're working on this, and it's a matter of thinking about multiple dimensions. There really isn't a single dimension of generosity or of liberalism. There are multiple dimensions on which states have more and less inclusive and have expanded or contracted assistance. And that is work that will be forthcoming.
We'll look forward to that.
We always say research is needed, and we're doing it.
Yes, that's great. That's great. So obviously this research and these questions come in an era when we're hearing a lot about the possibility of devolving more discretion to states in programs, talking about block granting food stamps or block granting Medicaid. Do you have any thoughts about the likely result of those kind of policy changes? Any thoughts about evidence that should go into policymakers' considerations in making those kind of policies?
This is Janet. I'll just jump in to say that's a complicated political question, of course.
Yeah.
I think it's worth backing up just to say what I know many of us know already. It's very hard to predict what's coming in the next few years. I think there seems to be a pretty clear disjuncture between the language and the interests of the president-elect and, of course, the leaders in both the House and Senate. That the president-elect has, I think by most accounts, expressed very little interest, actually, in widespread social policy cutting or retrenchment. In fact, in some cases, he's talked about protecting entitlements. So I think to some extent it depends on who's dominant and whether this agenda is captured by, we know, a much more active agenda in Congress, so which would be much more in the direction of decentralization and cutting. And so I think we don't really know. I would say everybody should be ready. One thing is clear, though, if I could say this, is there's a lot of research from across the states and across countries that links the results of these programs to outcomes. We know that cash assistance programs are crucial in reducing poverty. We know that in-kind programs are reduce poverty through reducing expenditures. So I would just say I think there is a huge amount of knowledge. I often say this in political settings. Understanding how these programs work is not rocket science. We actually know a lot about how they function and what their outcomes are. The much more complicated questions relate to political will. So I think that turns us to the questions about framing and language and trying to turn what we've been talking about here today into language and stories and narratives that are more useful, outside of the academic setting. So we might be able to say a little bit more about that. But again, there's very little mystery about the effects of these programs. And I think for those of us in the academic world, it's sort of frustrating to hear otherwise in the political sphere.
Yeah. I'll have to agree with that. Anything else that Sarah or Marcia wanted to add on that? Or?
Well, I would add that I think we do know a lot about how these programs work in general to increase and support economic well-being and security for families. What we haven't known is how variable they are. And I don't think we've really grappled with the extent of variability and inequality across states, or to even grapple with the question of whether variability is in itself a good or a bad. There's a robust debate, and there has been for many decades, about, well, is this a way that states are more responsive to local needs and local political interests, or is this a form of inequality and load shedding? And I think that we haven't really grappled with the two ways we might think about state-to-state variation, and one is a normative question about inequalities. And literally this question that you get such a different package of assistance if you live in a different part of the country. And then second, the impact. And again, here we do have research that suggests that the more centralized, the more uniform the program, the more effective it is at ensuring economic security. And we often contrast the Social Security programs for the elderly with the safety net programs for the working age. It's a pretty dramatic policy experiment and lesson in the value of more centralized programs.
So this research obviously has a lot of overlap and relevance to kind of the work that's been done on migration towards welfare magnets, and I think there's most of that evidence seems to indicate that there's not a lot of people moving to take advantage of more generous benefits in states. So maybe a little bit, but not much. Does that sort of fit with your understanding? Do you think they might reach a threshold where that changes if divergence becomes great enough?
So this is Marcia again. Well, I think it actually, as you say, I would agree that the preponderance of the evidence suggests that people don't move to get higher benefits. And one of the things that strikes me is the sheer complexity of the safety net, that there isn't a program you go and apply for, or that a program that your family member or friend might tell you is more generous in the next state. It's a whole kind of patchwork of programs that you may or may not be eligible for, depending on your income and your work and your family structure at a certain point in time. So, I think one of the things that this points to is that the sheer complexity of the safety net, it would take a genius to actually figure out that you'd be better off moving 20 miles across a state border. I mean, we were spending, our careers trying to figure it out. We're not geniuses. We haven't figured it out. So I think really that's another way of understanding that the concern that there's a strategic location and residence relocation to take advantage of these benefits is also challenged by both the low levels and the low likelihood of receipt in all of these programs, and also by the complexity of knowing which program you may or may not be able to get in another state.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is, I think we've reached the end of our time, but this has been very interesting, and look forward to more of this work and future work on this topic. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to our audience. So there's a reminder that a recording of today's webinar will be available on the IRP webpage starting tomorrow. And we invite you to join IRP for future webinars. To enroll for our next webinar, you can click on the link that's on your screen right now, in fact. On Wednesday, January 18th, James Gushka of Deloitte Consulting and Justin Sidnor from the Wisconsin School of Business will present a seminar on linking data science and behavioral science to build better public policy. Registration information for that and information about future webinars will also be available on our webpage. So look there. Thank you again for joining us, and so long. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.